All right. I know it's late. It's late, but there's no other fucking way I can do this. 8 episodes. Rings of Power came to a close. And compared to everybody else on the internet who can't put their negative bias aside, I'm basically the last bastion of truth that you people have. And I know my opinion outweighs the negative. Because there's a lot of people who say, if you like this show, then you're not a fan of Lord of the Rings. Well, let me correct those sour pussies out there. I was about 6, 7 years old. Fellowship of the Ring first dropped. And that was my first theatrical experience. After that was The Two Towers. Then The Return of the King. Then I started to play every single video game. I watched those movies more than my mom has read the Bible. I know the Tolkien lore more than probably a Catholic or a Christian knows the Bible. So nobody can tell me that I don't know what the fuck I am talking about. Somebody had the nerve to tell me, oh, if I enjoy this show, that I'm not a Tolkien fan. Well, let me tell you something that these people will not tell you about this show. It's the same thing with the original trilogy and then the 6 Hobbit films. The creators are not allowed to use every single piece of work that Tolkien has written. You are only given a specific amount to work with. So when people say, every time I hear the argument saying, oh, why don't they get the, what is that here? If someone says they are not a Lord of the Rings fan, that's gatekeeping black speech. Yes, it is. These people themselves are gatekeeping for something that they don't even understand. There's a bunch of legality behind this. If a company can't be given the entirety of the Silmarillion, which the Second Age is based off of, what do you expect them to work with? They're only given the notes and the appendices that you find at the back of the book. And even then, what a lot of people don't seem to realize is that J.R.R. Tolkien, before he died, his son had to take over and finish the work. And his son and his father sometimes contradicted each other with the outcomes of Middle-earth and its characters. There really is no clear-cut line in the sand of how to do the story. People say you want to do the First Age. The First Age is impossible to do. It only works in a book. What works in a book will not always work as an adaptation. Even the Lord of the Rings extended cuts, which I've watched over and over, only follow 30% of the trilogy. So those movies are praised. People bash The Hobbit, but The Hobbit was not only close, it gave you more extensions to Middle-earth. It's just that people nowadays, if you don't do it their way, or don't do, like, fans don't always know what the fuck they're talking about, because every fan is looking at it from a selfish, entitled point of view. You know? Oh, and Men of the West said if someone likes the show and gets into the books, more power to them. Okay, but at the end of the day, they shouldn't bash people or bash what people enjoy. If you don't like the show, then don't watch it. But if you don't watch it, that means you can't talk about it and make up stuff about it. Because that's where I'm going to take you to task. If that's one thing I can't stand, it's the same thing with the Star Wars community. If I catch you making shit up, I'm going to call you out for it and I'm going to embarrass you publicly. Now that I got that out the way, I've watched every episode of Rings of Power. From when it dropped September 1st, all the way up to now October 14th, to the final episode. And what I don't understand is how people don't understand the story in the show. It's a condensed variation of the Second Age. Because let's be real, you would not be able to faithfully adaptate the Second Age. There is far too much shit that happens across thousands of years. And what about the films? The films condense the timeline. Frodo left from the Shire when he was technically 40. And in the movie, they did it when he was in his 20s. So you're trying to tell me that people were going to watch a movie that takes place 20 years after the initial beginning? No, because most modern audiences are retarded. Let's be real. Most modern audiences are stupid. Every episode in this season drew at least from what it could from the Silmarillion without violating any of the laws or the copyright placed between the creators of the show and the Tolkien estate. And what the fans are asking for is stuff that cannot be used. So you can see how they're giving basically people oxymoron arguments. And I hate when people do that, because the only way these people can get their point across is if they put you in a position that you cannot answer back, which is, people like that piss me the fuck off. I didn't have a problem with none of the actors in this show, if at all. Like with Galadriel, with Elrond, Celebrimbor. I want to talk about the elves first before I get to each race of characters. And there's nothing wrong with multiple races of people playing different characters. You're trying to tell me that there was no such thing as black elves? You're trying to tell me there was no such thing as black dwarves? You do realize Tolkien wrote this story. He wrote The Lord of the Rings by Christian influence, Christian and Catholic influence. And basically, if you look at the god of Middle-earth, he's very similar to the god in real life, which created multiple races, but multiple variations of people of different color within those races. What about the people from the east that serve Sauron? They were dark-skinned people. Is it okay to see the dark-skinned people portrayed as the bad guys, but you don't want to see them portrayed as elves or dwarves? Okay? Not every race is solely white. There is no solely white race in real life. Okay? So people who bring up that argument, you're fucking retarded. I had no problem with the chick that played Galadriel. There's really no clear-cut depiction of how Galadriel was, because there's just too much things that get lost in translation during the Second Age. And even the fans say that the Second Age was scarcely documented. So you have a version of it in the books. That's fine. No one's taking that from you. But let people have a version of it on screen. Okay? It still falls under, if this is not the Lord of the Rings the way you depicted it, you could just simply hit the off switch on the TV, or don't even bother to click on Amazon Prime. It's really that hard. It's not that hard, but people make it seem like, oh, I gotta watch it anyway. But if you're gonna watch it, see, the thing is, when people watch it, they're already going into it with a negative mindset. So this is why I don't take what a lot of people have been saying about the show very seriously, because they're looking at it from an entitled, ignorant point of view. And that clearly showed from the first episode. The fact that we even seen hints of the First Age, or we saw glimpses of the First Age, is a miracle in itself. Okay? And let me remind everybody, this show is supposed to take place in the Jackson universe. There is no origin in the Jackson universe of the Second Age besides the prologue. So this could be its own variation of the Second Age to the movies that we love so much. Okay, look, nothing's going to top the original trilogy of Lord of the Rings. Okay, even I know that. I don't want nothing to top it. That's why when I look at The Hobbit, I don't see The Hobbit as better. I see The Hobbit alongside of it. Because when you look at The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, it's just one gigantic story broken off to 6 films that you can watch from beginning to end. And this show is telling a condensed version of what is going to be the forging of all the great rings, the rise of Mordor, the rise of Sauron, and the War of the Last Alliance. That's really what they need to cover. But you have to take liberties in certain sections to make sense in a show. And that's what I feel is getting lost in translation with people who talk about this show. They want a 100% adaptation when there is no such thing as a faithful adaptation. Anything that's ever been adapted has never been adapted 100%. because things will either get lost in translation or things are going to, like, what if something works in the book but looks stupid on the screen? You know, people like yourselves are not in positions, like, clearly you're not in these kind of creative liberty positions to even think like the people who have to actually work on these kind of things. What of an argument of adapting faithfully from source materials? Well, they want the source material of the Silmarillion adapted to 100%, which is impossible. And don't get me wrong, I can tell you, out of all the episodes, we got 8 episodes, right? There are 4 episodes that are hit and miss, and there are 4 that are actually really good. Yes, the season is 50-50, but with any first season of any show, the first seasons are never really that great to begin with for any show. Season 1s are usually massive build-ups to what's coming. And for people who say, oh, the show is too slow, then you never read the fucking books to begin with. The books are extremely, and I mean extremely, slow. Okay? How long did it take for the journey to start in the books? Frodo got the ring when he was in his 20s, and he didn't leave the Shire until he was in his 40s. So in the book, it took 20 years before the journey even began. But you don't hear nobody complaining about that when you see the film. The journey only takes 11 months in the film, where in the book, it took 20 years before it even started. Exactly. A show takes time to find its footing. Not only that, you have to build up a lot of stuff. Okay? Especially in the world of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings has a lot of build up to a lot of things. And they're only building up to what connects to the films. Like the Balrog in Moria, understanding how Sauron created the rings, his deception of the elves, the rise and fall of Numenor, the rise and fall of the Dwarf Kingdom, the war between the elves and Sauron, because I guarantee before we even see Numenor clash blades with Mordor, we're going to see the elves and Sauron clash blades first. And the character of Adar, who is like one of my favorite characters in the show, despite him being an Uruk, Adar is the closest thing we have to understanding the first age of Middle-earth. And they brought in a concept that's been contradicted by both Christopher Tolkien, like J.R.R. Tolkien had his idea of the elves being tortured into orcs, but then his son changed it to where orcs are bred and spawned. I heard no, he didn't get woke up by a falling leaf. It's just that they used the leaf in the episode to show how far deep the Balrog really is underground. So he still hasn't been discovered. He's still at a part underground where he can walk around. Because do you expect him to be sleeping the whole time? How the hell did all those caverns get made where he knew where to go? I mean, seriously. There's a lot of logical things in the show that people are ignoring, or they're just being blatantly ignorant to manufacture hate against the show because it's not, oh, me, Lord of the Rings, not my way fucking attitude. And it's easy to explain because, I deal with people like that all the time, and I see, how those arguments work. That's how I know how to catch these people and basically falter their arguments. And then once the moment they start name calling you, that means, they lost the argument. And, that happens a lot with Star Wars, especially when I make Star Wars videos, basically people lying about it all the time. But they're predominantly setting up the story of Khazad-dûm, which will become Moria. Halbrand, they showed how Mordor was created. And there's really no clear depiction, by my understanding, in the books either. I've not found one video on YouTube, even from the lore channels, how the land of Mordor came into creation. So you see how Mordor comes into creation in this show. And it would make sense that it's a southern region of Middle-earth, like it was. If you look at the map, the way it was set up on the Southlands map, you see the river of Rhûn, or Nirn. I forgot what sea is attached to Mordor, but you see it. Then when you see the Black Land starting to form in the final episode, you see when Sauron returns, aka Halbrand, he sees his land, and in his eyes you can see the slit, the eye slit that he will later become in the Tower of Barad-dûr. And it would make sense, like, from the jump, I knew Halbrand was Sauron, because Sauron he's called the Lord of Deceit for a reason. He is a master deceiver. I mean, how else did he fucking distribute the rings of men and the rings of dwarves without being deceitful? Now, there's a twist to how they made the rings in this one. The elven rings were made first. But think about it. In the movies, that's how it was explained. And nobody freaking complained back then. That was a major switch from the books. I know in the books, the 16 rings there were 16 rings made first, and they were like the practice rings, the dwarven rings and the rings of men. The 3 elven rings were made in secret without Sauron's understanding, and that's what pissed him off. One of the reasons he got pissed off. Because if anybody remembers Sauron's plan to completion, Sauron disguised himself, went to the elves, gave them the knowledge of otherworldly ring crafting, or at least thinking, oh, I know a little thing about making rings. How about I help you create these rings to help govern your lands? That was one of his plot points. Okay? He creates the 7 dwarf rings to try to subjugate them, and the 9 rings to subjugate the wills of men. In the films, they made them ring at the same time. No, that's kind of a flub with the films. The prologue makes it sound like that, but that's not the case. The elven rings were made last in the order of things when the rings were made. But in the show and in the films, it showed that the elven rings were first. Because you clearly hear Galadriel say at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, she says 3 were given to the elves, wisest, immortal, and the fairest of all beings. Then 7 for the dwarf lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls. And then 9 for the race of men. But see, they changed the poem. Okay? Because remember, the poem in the books in regards to the rings goes for the 3 elven rings for the kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. That's the poem. But you see how in the films they reversed it. In the show, at the end of the season, you hear what is to come, because you hear the song of the poem being sung. When it comes to the actors who played these roles, I did enjoy Halbrand. I enjoyed the people, the way Numenor was portrayed is about as close as how we actually imagine what Numenor would have been. Because there's no clear depictions of how Numenor was in the films. Only maybe a brief mentioning of from Aragorn and what was his name? Elrond. So I can just tell you the 4 episodes that I didn't like, I will be upfront with y'all. I didn't enjoy episode 2 that much. Neither 5, 4, or what was that other episode? I'm 50-50 with episode 7. Let's just say that. But I did enjoy 2, 3, 6, and 8. What about the Numenor boob armor? There was no Numenor boob armor. And, mind you, you guys know I am able to spot when there's anything woke in the show. There was nothing woke about the show at all. So, stuff that the Fandom Menace are going to bring up, like, because, again, they have no fandom that they belong to, so they have to make stuff up as they go along. What surprised me is actually how, at first, the mystery... See, The show relies on a mystery. The most predominant mystery is how is Sauron, who is Sauron? And they make you think it's Adar. But Adar is not Sauron. I knew it was BS that he said Sauron was killed. Why? Because if you look at Halbrand's actions, and if you look at the dialogue Halbrand used, what gave him away, wrong, their fandom is to hate fandoms. That is the truth. The thing that gave Halbrand away to me, in my eyes, is when Halbrand says, you know, if I could have that power and bind it to my very being. What did Sauron do when he created the One Ring? He binded half of his energy, his soul, and his will into its power to be able to subjugate all the other races that wore their rings. I don't think these people who watch this show understand this shit. And that's what kind of gets on my nerves. Is how is it that I can watch the show, and I've gone back and watched the episodes at least a good couple times already. I can understand where it's going. I don't think the wizard that came could be Gandalf. It could be one of the blue wizards that get separated, and he's going to Rune. But even if it is Gandalf, I won't be ticked off because there's no explanation in the movies that they came at the same time. Because in the books, the wizards all came at the same time to Middle-earth, except for the two blue wizards who showed up in the Second Age. But if this wizard is Gandalf, I'm not ticked off that it's Gandalf. Why? Because it already establishes his relationship with the early hobbits. Why does he have a love for the hobbits? And why would he go out his way to protect them? In a way, Sauron is created... Exactly. A lot of Lord of the Rings is also implied in the Harry Potter series. Sauron did the same thing Voldemort did. When Voldemort made his Horcruxes, Sauron created his One Ring and poured his half of his soul into the ring. So that way, if the ring's not destroyed, Sauron will never die. That's just basically how it is. I mean, don't get me wrong, he won't be at full power without it. He has to rely on his armies to do his work. But at the end of the day, Sauron is still immensely powerful. He's a Maiar spirit. So regardless of what's done to him physically, he will just still retain his physical form. Just like if you watch the extended cut to Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, a lot of people have the misinterpretation that Sauron is a great eye atop Barad-dûr. No, that's a projection of his power, the all-seeing eye. If you look into the Palantir, when Aragorn looks into it to taunt him, you see he has his body and he's holding the Palantir. He's in his tower. So he did have a body. It's just that he felt that he didn't need to step into the situation himself. I think the season could have benefited probably from more episodes. I think 8 for a season 1 dealing with the subject matter at hand of Lord of the Rings. 8 episodes is a little too short. And yes, every episode might have been like an hour to an hour and 10 minutes long. But that's the structural flub with Lord of the Rings in general. Lord of the Rings is massive setup to a lot of things. I mean, people are acting, why wasn't there a giant war in the middle of the season? So, would it have made sense in the Fellowship of the Ring that they showed the Battle of Helm's Deep? No, right? Because that requires buildup. A lot of people seem to forget how massive the War of the Last Alliance really was. Okay? So, I would say, I don't care if the second season is if the second season is also build up. Because in the next season, we have to see the creation of the rest of the rings. We have to see, I can guarantee this is probably how the seasons are going to go. This one, season 1 was just a slow build. It's the jumping off point. Season 2 will most likely deal with Sauron's deceit, the Balrog of Moria, and Sauron getting ready to launch his assault upon the elves. We might see a little bit of Numenor because we have to see that if he's, Isildur's alive, but they're playing that Isildur is, it KO'd, which doubt it because everybody is signed on for 5 seasons. So we have to also see Sauron get taken to Numenor, where he will corrupt the king Al-Farazon and cause the destruction. I think by the end of season 2 is when we probably see the destruction of Numenor. Then from season 3 and onward, we will see the creations of Gondor and Arnor. Then we will get into Sauron unleashing his armies, and we will get into the War of the Last Alliance. It's like the things that people don't understand nuanced storytelling, and they don't understand proper setup. And unfortunately, most Lord of the Rings fans don't even understand that, because most Lord of the Rings fans base their knowledge solely on the movies. I get it. Okay, I do. But you need to look at the writings. Can what works in the book really work in the film? If you were to do a faithful adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, like, it would be more than a trilogy itself. That's why a TV show format is the only compromise. You can't do the Second Age in 3 movies. You really cannot. No matter how hard you try, there will be no force on God's green earth that could make that happen. Okay? There's a lot of people that were from the jump going into this show to dislike it because it's not the films and it's not the books. Then if that's the case, why are there many adaptations of books that change things that are successful? The Harry Potter's movies changed a lot of shit, and that's one of the most successful franchises. What if it was 7 films? I think it would, okay, to do the Fellowship of the Ring, if you really want to know, to do the Fellowship of the Ring portion of the book, that would be 2 films in itself. Because of how long that shit was. The same thing with the 2, like, it would actually take 6 to 7 films to actually do the book page for page, word for word, scene by scene. So now imagine trying to do the Silmarillion. That bitch would be 12 movies in itself. The First Age would be 12 movies in its fucking self. But the problem is people want to stuff their fucking faces with so much shit right off the gate, and then what are you going to be left with? Like, really, what are you going to be left with? You should be grateful that the show exists at all. Okay? We haven't had any Lord of the Rings content since The Hobbit. We've had video games. We've had, a newer rendition of what was the recent book that came out? The Children of Hurin, which is First Age stuff. Lord of the Rings should come back, and it has come back with this show. And here's the thing I don't like, is why are people comparing this to Game of Thrones? They're 2 separate shows. You ever heard of comparison as the thief of joy? So if you're trying to compare this to another fantasy show, you're basically robbing that other show's identity when you do that. There's nothing of this show that relates to Game of Thrones either. Game of Thrones is its own thing. Game of Thrones may not be my particular thing, but I'm not going to trash the people that enjoy it. I see why they like it. It just doesn't do it for me. I'm more of a Lord of the Rings guy. So I would expect them to respect that, okay, you should see why I like Lord of the Rings, but what gives you the right to talk shit about it if you don't know what you're talking about? I mean, it's common sense, which a lot of moviegoers and a lot of show watchers really don't understand. And I get that modern media is polluted with all this filth and garbage, all this woke, SJW, LGBTQ crap. But the problem is we've become so desensitized to it, we can't tell the difference. And when you got people manufacturing bullshit and lies about shows, saying that, oh, this is in it, this represents this, and when it doesn't at all, it makes you wonder, how the fuck can you trust what they say about the show? Okay? How can you trust what they really say. It's like common sense. I mean, I'm going to end up waiting. I mean, I'm looking forward to season 2. Season 1 was at least a 70% for me. It wasn't 100. It was a 70. But that comes with the territory of no season 1 of a show is ever really that good or really that bad either. Season 1s are always jumping off points. They're always setups, massive setups for what comes later. And if you can't be patient for it, then just don't watch it. That's really it. Just don't watch it. There's too much in the first age, and there's too much in the second age, and there was too much in the Lord of the Rings. Okay? The trilogy itself is still not the most faithful adaptation because they cut out 70% of the stuff from the book anyway. So if you can look at the film and know that, then you can look at the show in the same light. People just need to take off their freaking biased blindfolders. So I'm probably going to get into this topic with Keo tomorrow. This was just the first phase of it because him and I know the lore pretty well. So tomorrow we're going to discuss a lot of the lore behind it and the lore ideas that went into the show. I just wanted to give my overview of the season 1 and telling you how you should look at it and how you should go into it. And if you got somebody whispering in your ear, just cut them off very quick. Because 9 times out of 10, they won't know what they're talking about. All right. So it's late. I'm going to probably head off to bed. So I'll see you all in the morning.